Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we're in part 4 of this epic series on common mistakes about philosophy and religion. By the way, check out the playlist, which will eventually house the full 7-part series that should be popping up in the corner. I already covered some important preliminary points in part 1, so let's just jump right into the mistakes. Oh, and of course, check out the resource document linked in the description. So let's begin with mistakes pertaining to the moral argument. And yes, I know it's more accurate to say moral arguments, but deal with it. Continuing on from part 3, we're going to start with mistake number 105, confusing moral ontology and epistemology. So moral ontology refers, in this context, to things like whether there are moral truths and moral properties and moral facts, and if so, what's their nature, or do they need grounds or explanations? And if they do need grounds or explanations, what are those grounds? So moral ontology really just concerns questions pertaining to the nature and existence of moral truths, moral facts, and moral properties. By contrast, moral epistemology concerns our epistemic access to moral truths and facts and properties. It concerns whether we know or justifiably believe moral truths, and if we do, how we come to know or justifiably believe them. There's a crucial distinction then between moral ontology and moral epistemology. Whereas the former concerns being or reality, like whether there are such things and what nature they have, the latter, by contrast, concerns our epistemic access to reality, how we come to know about it or form justified beliefs about it. These things are not to be confused. There are lots of ways that people tend to make this sort of mistake in concrete circumstances. For instance, consider moral ontological arguments, that is, arguments which aim to show that God is required for, or perhaps is the best explanation for, the existence of objective morality. In responding to moral ontological arguments, some atheists will say that we can be perfectly moral without believing in God. That is, one can know and behave in accordance with moral truths, even though one doesn't believe in God. This is true, of course, but it's utterly irrelevant to the moral ontological argument, and it confuses moral ontology with moral epistemology. Right? The point of the moral ontological argument is not that one has to believe in God in order to believe or know various moral truths. Instead, the point is that God's existence is a necessary condition for the reality of moral truths. I don't think that that claim is correct, but the point here is just please don't confuse the order of knowing with the order of being. You may be able to know that there are certain moral truths without knowing or even believing that God exists, but it does not follow from that God's existence is not a necessary condition for the reality of moral truths. And it's also not just people from the atheist camp who make this mistake. I'm simply using this as an illustration. Mistake number 106, misunderstanding internal critiques. So I once saw this on social media, and it was painfully wrong, as most things on social media are. Atheist says, there are no moral oughts. Morality is subjective. Also atheist, God is evil. These are two incompatible statements driven from a contradictory worldview. You have no moral complaint of God if you make these statements. So just about everything is wrong with this. For starters, the person who made the post is characterizing the atheist as saying that there are no moral oughts and morality is subjective. Right? So if morality is subjective, presumably that means that there are various moral truths that depend on our beliefs or stances or attitudes or preferences or desires, or something about our subjective attitudes. But that doesn't mean that there are no moral oughts. It just means that whether there are such moral oughts depends on various subjective stances that people take. So this is a very weird thing to impute to atheists, to say that there are no moral oughts, but also that morality is subjective. But anyway, that's not the mistake that I want to focus on here. The mistake that I want to focus on here is misunderstanding internal critiques. So you perform an internal critique when you take a view and show that there are problems internal to that view itself. That is, that certain elements of the view itself conflict with one another. And when the non-theist, who's also a subjectivist about morality, argues that God is evil, say by pointing to Old Testament atrocities wherein God drowns innocent babies, commands child sacrifice, sanctions stoning as a punishment, etc., when the subjectivist makes this sort of argument, they only need to say that the theist is committed to objective moral truths, as well as our reliable access to those truths. Given these commitments, we can then point out how God's actions seem to conflict with those objective moral truths to which we have reliable access under theism. None of this requires the subjectivist to embrace moral realism. And of course, there's also the point that the post here is mistaken in characterizing atheism as a worldview committed to moral subjectivism. So as I said, literally everything is wrong with this post. For starters, it characterizes atheism as committed to moral subjectivism. It's clearly not. Secondly, it seems to even misunderstand the nature of moral subjectivism, because moral subjectivism is perfectly compatible with there being moral oughts. So that's strike 2 against the post. And then strike 3 against the post was that it doesn't understand the nature of an internal critique. The subjectivist can perfectly well mount an argument that God is evil because they're just saying, or they need only be saying, that the theist is committed to there being objective moral truths to which we have reliable access, and in the case of a Christian theist, they can point to various things that seem for all the world to be deeply immoral actions on God's part. And given that our moral intuitions, on their own view, are tracking objective moral facts, they have a conflict within their own view. That's all that the subjectivist needs to say. So, 3 strikes, and this post is out, and we're moving on to mistake number 107, which is asserting that there can be no grounding of morality under atheism, while also ignoring boatloads of potential groundings. Now, note that the fact that there are boatloads of potential groundings of morality under atheism does not by itself show that there is an adequate grounding of morality under atheism. The point of bringing up this mistake is that it's usually the theists who are positively asserting that there can be no grounding of morality under atheism. And so the burden of justification is on them to positively disprove each and every potential grounding of morality under atheism. Right? The burden is not on the atheist to show that they do indeed have a successful, adequate account of morality. The burden is on the theist to positively establish that there can be no such adequate grounding of morality under atheism. And so then, if the theist is in the business of asserting that there can be no grounds of morality under atheism, well then they cannot ignore boatloads of potential groundings of morality under atheism. They have to roll up their sleeves, systematically proceed through each and every one of them, and systematically tear them down, giving positive reasons to think that they're inadequate, insufficiently plausible, etc. So, there are many specific theories or accounts as to what grounds the rightness or wrongness or permissibility or impermissibility or various other moral properties of certain actions in a way that doesn't involve God. There are many such accounts. Here's just a small sampling of a dozen or so. And again, these are basically just accounts of what grounds the moral properties of certain actions in ways that don't involve God. So one is by appeal to utility. An act's moral properties could be grounded in facts about utility. That is, facts about what would or wouldn't maximize well-being, understood perhaps in terms of pain and pleasure, as in hedonic versions of utilitarianism, or desired satisfaction or dissatisfaction, or perhaps just a broader notion of flourishing and languishing, etc. A second option is by appeal to the essence of normative properties. The fact that an act instantiates the moral properties that it does could be ultimately grounded in the very nature or essence of those moral properties, as John Bengtson, Terence Cuneo, and Russ Schaefer-Landau have argued in a recent Mind article entitled The Source of Normativity. I've got that linked in the resource document. I'm going to mention more on this later, but for now, just a couple notes are in order. So one might object that this account just boils down to saying, well, that's just the way it is. Acts just instantiate the moral properties that they do, and that's just the way it is, end of story. But, as I say here, that just isn't true. That's not an accurate description of this account. It's not a good objection to this account. The account here provides a unifying, illuminating explanation of normative facts. In the case at hand, the specific normative facts are basically facts that specify that an act instantiates moral properties, like being wrong or right, etc. So the account here provides a unifying, illuminating explanation of normative facts in terms of essence facts. That is, facts about the essences of the relevant normative properties, like the property of rightness or the property of wrongness. As Bengtson, Cuneo, and Schaefer-Landau argue in their article, this is not a vacuous, unilluminating account which merely adverts to the very fact in need of explanation, as happens in the case of someone saying to their questioning child, that's just the way that the world is. Instead, the account cites a categorically different kind of fact altogether, namely non-normative facts about essences, to explain normative facts. In this case, again, facts about the moral properties of actions. And it's at least like a decently plausible, or at least a reasonable, prima facie reasonable account by my lights. Like, once you grasp what the normative property of badness is, there's no mystery as to why, for example, intense suffering is bad. Likewise, once you grasp what it is to be wrong, there's no mystery as to why torturing a child for fun is wrong. This is characteristic of a good explanation, in my view. Once one grasps the explanans, there seems to be little to no mystery as to why the explanandum obtains. An explanandum is basically just what you're seeking to explain, and the explanans is what you are citing in order to explain the explanandum. So in my view, the account seems to be entirely unifying and illuminating, and at the very least, it's an account, and theists can't claim that there is no non-theistic account of morality on offer. There are certainly non-theistic accounts of morality, and this is uncontroversial among professional meta-ethicists. Even if the theist thinks a theistic account has notable theoretical advantages over non-theistic accounts, we should all recognize that non-theists can still account for morality, right? Having a better account than someone else should not be confused with taking them to have no account at all. And again, an essence here isn't just like some spooky or ghostly entity. No, the essence of something is just what it is to be that thing. So for instance, what it is to be water is to be H2O. What it is to be triangular is to be a closed plane figure with 3 straight sides. What it is to be temperature is to be mean molecular kinetic energy, and so on. Those are just rough glosses. But anyway, back to the main track. Remember, we're going through a number of different theories or accounts as to what grounds the rightness or wrongness or various other moral properties of certain actions in ways that don't involve appealing to God. We started by saying that an act's moral properties could be grounded in facts about utility. They could be ultimately grounded in the very nature or essence of the relevant normative properties. A third account appeals to Kantian universalizability, so an act's moral properties could be grounded in facts about universalizability. So, for example, whether one could, in performing the act, consistently will that everyone does the act. Fourth, you could appeal to Kantian ends in themselves, right? An act's moral properties could be grounded in whether the act treats someone as a mere means rather than an end in themselves. And there are different ways, of course, that you can cash out treating someone as a mere means. One of them is to treat them in ways that give no or hardly any weight to their interests, or in other words, kind of ignoring their interests in your treatment of them. Alternatively, maybe it involves interfering with or subverting the exercise of their rational capacities, like preventing them from setting and pursuing their own ends. So when you're treating someone as a mere means, you're not only treating them as a means, but also perhaps you're like disregarding their interests, or maybe you're interfering with their rational capacities, or maybe you're harming or risk harming them, or or maybe you're just treating them in a way to which they could not reasonably consent. There's actually lots of debate here about how you cash out what it is to treat someone as a mere means. We're not going to get into that, but I just wanted to highlight that in case it was nebulous to anyone. Fifthly, of course, there's contractualism, right? An act's moral properties could be grounded in whether principles allowing the act would be justifiable to others in a fair decision situation. Put differently, and with a Scanlonian vibe after T.M. Scanlon, an act's moral properties could be grounded in whether the norms or rules underpinning one's behavior could reasonably be objected to if they were to be agreed upon from an informed and unbiased vantage point. Sixth, there's, of course, virtue ethics. An act's moral properties could be grounded in whether the act is one that a virtuous person would do, or whether it expresses a virtuous or vicious disposition, as the case may be. There's also care ethics, of course. An act's moral properties could be grounded in whether the act is one that a caring person would do. You're basically just substituting virtue and vice with being caring and uncaring. There are various ideal observer theories. An act's moral properties could be grounded in whether an ideally situated observer would approve of the act. Peter Railton's naturalistic account, right? An act's moral properties could be grounded in objective facts concerning the maximal fulfillment of idealized desires, which are basically what individuals would want themselves to desire if they had access to all the relevant information and perhaps if they were rational and various other idealizing constraints. There's discourse ethics. An act's moral properties could be grounded in universalizable presuppositions that underpin discourse between persons. See William Regg's work on this. There's, of course, pluralism, right? And act's moral properties could be grounded in a plethora of the aforementioned potential grounds, or in just particular facts about actions on a case-by-case basis. For example, gross power imbalances, infliction of pain with neither the victim's consent nor comparable benefits accruing to the victim, etc. There are also various natural law accounts, so an act's moral properties could be grounded in whether it contravenes the ends built into one's nature. And more generally, right, the reason why I'm going through all this, more generally, as Kevin Sharp rightly notes with respect to non-theistic moral realist accounts of morality, there are literally dozens of theories of moral values and moral duties that are objective, that aren't naturalistic in character, although some of the ones that I just canvassed are indeed naturalistic, and that make no appeal to gods. Just look at the work, for instance, of G.E. Moore, William Ross, Christine Korsgaard, Thomas Scanlon, Derek Parfit, Philippa Foote, David Enoch, Russ Shaver-Landau, Rosalind Hirsthaus, John McDowell, Jonathan Dancy, H.A. Pritchard, Roger Crisp, Joseph Raz, Gene Hampton, Ray Wedgwood, and that's just a few. Of course, the accounts that I just surveyed are accounts of what it is in virtue of which an act instantiates moral properties, or satisfies moral predicates. This should not be confused with questions about the nature or identity of those moral properties themselves. For instance, there are separate questions about the nature and ontological status of properties more generally. For example, trope theory versus nominalism versus Aristotelian realism versus Platonism, etc. And there are also separate questions about what the moral properties of wrongness, rightness, etc. are. For example, are they natural in the sense of being reducible to properties amenable to scientific investigation, such as the maximization of pleasure over pain? Or are they non-natural in the sense of not being so reducible? And so on, right? These are all separate questions within metaethics, but they're questions whose resolution needn't require any introduction of God. And so, as I take a breath, the broader point here within mistake number 107 is that you cannot assert that there can be no groundings of morality under atheism, there's no account of morality under atheism. You can't do that while also ignoring boatloads of potential groundings, boatloads of potential ways to account for various acts instantiating moral properties, like torture being wrong, say. In other words, various groundings of why things have the moral properties they do that make no appeal to God. There's like mountains of literature on like each of these proposals. So if someone wants to say that under atheism, nothing accounts for why things instantiate the moral properties that they do, etc., they have to systematically falsify each and every one of these. And as for accounts of like what moral properties are, like whether they're non-natural, whether they're natural, and whether we need to appeal to God in accounting for that, that will be a question that I will take up soon in this video. So yes, this brings us to another mistake often committed, and it's probably one that I myself have committed in the past, since I haven't always been clear on what exactly the target explanandum of non-theistic accounts of morality is. So, mistake number 108. Conflating an account of why things instantiate moral properties with an account of what those moral properties themselves are. So in the above list, I was only considering about a dozen or so ways that philosophers have explained why things instantiate moral properties, where those explanations are entirely non-theistic in character. It's pretty clear then, at least in my view, that God isn't needed to ground morality in the sense of grounding why things instantiate moral properties. But there is something else that we need an account of, namely, what those moral properties themselves are, of rightness and wrongness, and of course goodness and badness and so on. And notice that these are different target phenomena. On the one hand, we have accounts of why things instantiate moral properties, what is it in virtue of which things have the moral properties that they do, and on the other hand, we have accounts of what those moral properties themselves are. And as I say here, I think it's pretty clear that A does not require God, an account of why things instantiate moral properties. And that is significant, since tons of people who leverage the moral argument think otherwise. Many such people think that there's simply no way that you can ground the moral properties of actions and states of affairs under atheism. That's just wrong, as we've seen. There are lots of at least potential ways that you can do that. Still, though, one could, in principle, run a moral argument in terms of B rather than A, right? In terms of giving an account of what moral properties are. One can grant that while the explanation for why things instantiate moral properties appeals to various facts that don't involve God, we do need God when we're giving an account of what moral properties themselves are. For instance, perhaps what it is to be morally wrong just is to be forbidden by God, or perhaps to be inconsistent with certain essential features of God. In such a case, the property of being morally wrong would either consist in or be identical to the property being forbidden by God. Now, I don't buy these sorts of views even for a second, but my point is simply that merely from the fact that we can give non-theistic accounts in response to A, it doesn't thereby follow that we've given non-theistic accounts in response to B. That is, even if we can give non-theistic accounts of why things instantiate moral properties, prescinding from what those moral properties are, like leaving that out of consideration, it does not thereby follow that you can give non-theistic accounts of what those moral properties themselves are. We would also want to show that there are coherent non-theistic accounts of what moral properties are. Thankfully, though, there are many such accounts. I mean, for starters, we can just take moral properties to be sui generis, irreducibly normative properties. Okay, that's a mouthful. That just means that they're a unique kind of property and can't be identified with or reduced to other non-moral properties, such as the property of like maximizing pleasure over pain, or the property of being commanded by God, or the property of being consistently universalizable, etc. Importantly, there's nothing incoherent about this account of what moral properties are, and it doesn't involve God in any way. So there is at least one coherent non-theistic account of morality in the sense of a coherent non-theistic account falling within the B category here. We already went through many such accounts falling within the A category here. By contrast, if we don't want to take moral properties to be irreducibly normative, that is, not to be reducible to any like non-normative or non-moral properties, well then the non-theist can simply identify moral properties with, or reduce them to, various different sorts of non-moral features. For instance, the atheist can employ in this context the accounts given in response to A and develop corresponding reductive accounts of moral properties in response to B. What would this look like? Well, it would look like the following, right? We're basically just going through the dozen accounts in response to A and developing corresponding reductive accounts in response to B. So the corresponding reductive account of what it is to be morally right and what it is to be morally wrong for the first account that we looked at would be something like the property of being right is identical to or consists in the property maximizing well-being. And ditto for other moral properties. For example, being wrong is identical to or consists in minimizing well-being. Another option is to say that the property of being right is identical to or consists in the property of being consistently universalizable, and ditto for other moral properties. You could say that the property of being right is identical to or consists in the property of treating others as ends in themselves and not merely as means, and ditto for other moral properties. You could say that the property of being right is identical to or consists in the property of being justifiable in a fair decision situation, or flowing from a virtuous disposition, or flowing from a caring disposition, or perhaps the property of being right is identical to or consists in the property of maximally fulfilling ideals idealized desires. Or perhaps it's identical to or consists in the property of fulfilling the ends built into one's nature, and so on. Once more, there's nothing incoherent about at least some of these reductive accounts of moral properties, and none of them involve God in any way. So again, I repeat, not only are there boatloads of philosophically defensible ways to ground the instantiation of moral properties under atheism, that is, not only are there lots of defensible non-theistic accounts falling under that A category that I mentioned above, but there are also boatloads of philosophically defensible ways to explain what moral properties are under atheism. That is, there are boatloads of coherent non-theistic accounts falling under B here. So in my view at least, it's not plausible that under atheism there couldn't possibly be any moral facts. Certainly it's not true that under atheism there can be no coherent, reasonable account of morality, either in the sense of A or B. And any apologist or any theist who wants to mount moral arguments, either focusing on explaining why things instantiate moral properties or focusing on explaining what moral properties are, if they want to say that accounting for these things requires appealing to God, then they need to systematically proceed through each and every one of the well over a dozen non-theistic accounts and show them to be false. That's the burden that they're taking on when they're saying that you need God to explain the relevant moral properties. And in my view, this monumental task has not even come close to being accomplished by any defender of the moral argument. Usually you just get hand-wavy assertions to the effect that, oh, there's just no way to account for morality under atheism. And oftentimes, if you press them to say why, usually they just come up with like rhetorical questions. Where like, well, how could you do it without God? Like, well, for a rhetorical question isn't an argument. Firstly, it's not an argument for their claim. But also, here are boatloads of ways that could, in principle, be accounts of morality under atheism. Each of which commands assent by some formidable philosophers, and each of which has garnered a literature of its own. So I think there are two overarching lessons here. First, theistic defenders of the moral argument should stop saying that there's no way, in principle, to account for morality under atheism. There are well over a dozen ways that one could, at least in principle, coherently account for morality under atheism. Second, if the theist wants to make the comparatively more respectable claim that there's no plausible way to account for objective morality under atheism, or maybe there's no satisfactory way to account for objective morality under atheism, then the burden is on them to systematically proceed through each and every one of these well over a dozen accounts and show why each and every one of them is false or deeply implausible or just simply can't be satisfactory. I certainly don't think that defenders of the moral argument have successfully accomplished such a monumental task, and for most apologists who run the argument, they haven't even attempted it. Indeed, most of them aren't even aware of these other accounts, and so they aren't even aware of their burden to systematically dismantle each and every one of them. At least in my view, that's why moral arguments tend to have enduring appeal. It simply preys on people's ignorance of the field of metaethics. But moving on to mistake number 109, at this juncture, many will commit the next mistake, which is citing some prominent atheists who think that without God, there can be no morality. Like, apparently, Nietzsche, Sartre, however you pronounce that, I don't know, I'm sorry, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, J.L. Mackie, and Alex Rosenberg. If you, Joe, are correct, well then, why are there so many atheists who disagree with you? I'm face-palming. You can't see me face-palming right now, but I am. There's a lot to say in response. First, I haven't seen anyone even attempt a rigorous survey of historical and contemporary philosophically informed atheists to determine what proportion thinks God is required for morality. At best, we get a few examples of a few prominent continental atheist philosophers, plus a couple more recent error theorists. Simplifying a bit, error theorists think that all moral claims are false. Okay, so we're just systematically in error about the moral domain. Now, that's not a very impressive sample, is it? And it's also one that was clearly selected non-randomly. And it's also well known that most of these continental atheist existentialists were like the opposite of rigorous and typically failed to present actual arguments for their views. Clearly then, the sample is not representative of the best available work by non-theists. So it's like, what are you doing to support your moral argument or your claim that without God there can be no morality by like appealing to like a handful of these atheists? It's obviously such a small sample, obviously a non-randomly selected sample, and thereby an obviously biased sample. And the sample itself consists of like pretty bad cases, because at least most of them, or at least a sizable portion of the people who are cited, are like continental atheist existentialists, who certainly aren't representative of the best available non-theistic metaethical work, and also citing non-theistic philosophers who are well outside the mainstream within non-theistic metaethics, namely non-theistic philosophers who fall within the camp of error theory. So that's the first point, or first cluster of points. Secondly, we have the question being posed to me, well, why do at least some prominent atheists disagree with me? Like, I think there can be objective morality without God. So then people might pose the question to me, well, then why are some prominent atheists disagreeing with you, Joe? Doesn't that indicate that I'm wrong? Well, as I say here, no. Of course, I mean, it's very slight Bayesian evidence, but there are also tons of prominent atheists who agree with me. And moreover, I've evaluated the arguments put forward by those who disagree with me and found them wanting. And by the way, I haven't actually found any argument in Nietzsche or Sartre, but rather pure assertion, and those of Mackey and Rosenberg are incredibly poor in my view. As a result, I shouldn't feel compelled to significantly decrease my confidence in the conclusion that God isn't required for morality, or specifically objective morality. And what's more, I mean, I can rattle off tons of professional theistic philosophers who don't think God is needed for morality. Thomas Metcalfe, Terence Cuneo, Dustin Crum, Eric Sampson, Kenny Pierce, Liz Jackson, and so on down the list. So then I ask my hypothetical interlocutor the same rhetorical question that they asked me. Why do so many professional theist philosophers disagree with you? So that's my second point, or cluster of points here. My third point is that it's interesting to consider why the vast majority of professional metaethicists agree with me. Like, proportionally very few professional metaethicists think that God is required for morality. Why is that? So in short, I can pose these rhetorical questions all the same, right? And in fact, my rhetorical questions are far more powerful. So I think appealing to some prominent atheists as if that's supposed to have some, like, significant evidential weight, I think that's just absurd. Absurd, to use Craig's phrase. And I also think that this rhetorical question here is not at all threatening, and in fact, there are far more threatening rhetorical questions for the theistic proponent of the moral argument who thinks that without God there can be no morality, or at least no objective morality. And then finally, under this mistake number 109, David Paulman recently put together a well-researched 3-hour video entitled Why I Don't Use Moral Arguments for Theism, and I wanted to share some of his criticisms of William Lane Craig's moral argument, which include cogent criticisms of Craig's strategy of citing some prominent atheists on behalf of his argument. I'd also recommend, by the way, watching the video in full. You can find it in the description within the resource document. I don't agree with everything in the video, but he does make a lot of compelling points against some of the main moral arguments in the literature. So again, I'd recommend watching the video in full. But here I'm just going to share some of his criticisms of William Lane Craig's moral argument.
Perhaps the best-known contemporary defender of a moral argument, and indeed perhaps the best-known Christian apologist of the modern day, is William Lane Craig. He offers a simple and straightforward deductive argument for God's existence based upon moral realism. Craig formulates his argument as follows. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. I have already expressed my skepticism with respect to the second premise. Craig doesn't typically attempt a sophisticated defense of this premise beyond the claim, rather presumptuously, that everyone already knows it to be true.
But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it.
In any case, what reason is there for thinking there are objective moral values? There must be a good argument for this. After all, there are no objective aesthetic values, quite plausibly, so Dr. Craig must give us an argument for saying there are objective moral ones. What is the argument? Well, it was striking, so I wrote it down. He said, there are objective moral values because deep down we know there are. That's it. That's the argument. Now, that may pass for an argument in Talbot Theological College. It may indeed pass for an argument in the White House. But, but this is Cambridge, and it doesn't pass for an argument here.
Nevertheless, I will grant the second premise for the sake of argument. But what reason is there to think that the first premise is true? Viewers need to understand how strong of a claim Craig is really making. His first premise entails not just that objective morality would be significantly different or unlikely given atheism. No, his first premise entails that there is no possible way for objective morality to exist at all given atheism. In defense of this premise, Craig writes, if God does not exist, then what is the foundation for moral values? More particularly, what is the basis for the value of human beings? If God does not exist, then it is difficult to see any reason to think that human beings are special or that their morality is objectively valid. But this is no defense of the first premise. This is just a question being posed to the atheist. Even if the atheist has no answer whatsoever to this question, it could merely remain an unanswered question. This would provide no grounds at all for concluding that only theism could explain moral facts. Moreover, Notice how Craig has merely presupposed that moral facts need a basis. He does not attempt to justify that assumption at all. He just assumes that God would be able to explain the existence of moral facts, but he makes no attempt to explain how God is supposed to do this. So Craig does not even touch my first and second challenges, nor does he justify the first premise of his argument. As Wielenberg points out, this response reveals an assumption that underlies much of Craig's criticism of non-theistic approaches to moral realism. Objective morality requires a foundation external to itself. However, there is simply no good reason to accept this assumption. Craig believes quite strongly that if God does not exist, then humans are just like animals. He says,
On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being or dog well-being or monkey well-being. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning.
Now these are the only sorts of defenses which Craig gives of the first premise of his argument, and it's difficult to see how Craig is not merely begging the question with statements like this. He asserts that given atheism, nothing is really wrong, but that is the very point of contention. That is the premise of his argument which he needs to support. As James Fodor laments, uncharacteristically, Craig does not provide any clear or coherent argument in favor of his crucial premise that moral facts cannot be grounded outside of God. Raphael Laddister is even harsher, saying, Craig continues to doubt that objective morality could exist without God, failing to rule out the possibility, while also failing to demonstrate that objective morality would certainly exist with God. Craig will sometimes quote prominent atheists such as Richard Dawkins, Bertrand Russell, Michael Ruse, or Friedrich Nietzsche, who have thought that moral facts do not exist because they believe that God does not exist.
Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Michael Ruse, a noted philosopher of science, explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. Now, as I said, this is a conclusion which is accepted by a great many atheist philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Russell, and Sartre. Though the conclusion is a painful one, these thinkers believe that honesty compels them to face it squarely.
But Craig clearly has no problem disagreeing with these atheists on a great many other things, so why has he suddenly chosen to treat their opinions as so authoritative in this case? As Walter Sinnott Armstrong points out, why should we believe that objective moral values depend on God? Because Russell, Ruse, and Nietzsche say so? But their claims are denied by many philosophers, atheists as well as theists. Even Russell and Ruse themselves denied these claims at other times in their careers, so Craig needs a reason to believe some authorities rather than others. Elsewhere, Sinnott Armstrong says, theists often cite our old foe, if God is dead, everything is permitted. But why believe this? Just because Nietzsche or Ivan Karamazov said so? Theists think that Nietzsche and Ivan are wrong about almost everything else, so why agree with them on this point? Atheists do not have to agree with everything that other atheists say. But not only is the first premise of Craig's argument unjustified, it is almost certainly false. There are dozens of proposed non-theistic accounts of morality on offer, but Craig never does any of the heavy lifting to show that they are all impossible. If even one non-theistic account of moral realism is even possible, then the first premise of his argument is refuted. Craig takes a very dismissive attitude towards these non-theistic moral theories, saying, simply providing a list of alternative moral theories does nothing to show the theory's explanatory adequacy, that these are good theories or plausible theories. But that misses the point. The first premise of his argument does not say that God is the most plausible or most adequate explanation of moral values and duties. It says that God is the only possible explanation. This is a very strong claim, which requires that Craig do the legwork of showing that each and every actual and hypothetical non-theistic moral theory is logically impossible. I submit that Craig has not even begun to accomplish that task. As James Fodor says, if Craig wants to do what he describes as serious metaphysics, then he must engage with these theories and show why they cannot serve as a foundation for objective morality. Simply ignoring them demonstrates a lack of serious engagement with the literature, and thus critically undermines Craig's argument. Furthermore, it is not enough for Craig to argue that we don't have sufficient reason to believe that any particular such theory of morality is true, for this would be to make only an epistemological claim that he insists is irrelevant to his argument. Instead, he must demonstrate that none of these theories can provide a plausible foundation for objective moral facts. Since he makes no such effort to do so, I believe that Craig has given very little reason for accepting his crucial premise. To take Eric Wielenberg's moral Platonism as an example, there doesn't seem to be anything logically incoherent about saying that morality consists in a supervenience or making relation between abstract moral properties and particular states of affairs. In his interactions with Wielenberg, Craig complains about such things as having no evidence for abstract entities, or finding it ambiguous as to how supervenience is supposed to work, claiming, Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant that it makes theism, which itself involves substantial metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison, and objecting that Wielenberg imputes to physical objects causal powers that are mysterious and completely unknown to contemporary physics. But none of these criticisms comes anywhere near to showing that Wielenberg's model is logically contradictory and thus impossible. As long as Wielenberg's model is even possible, the first premise of Craig's argument will be false. If it is possible for atheism to have objective moral values and duties, then it is false to claim that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
And this point here actually brings up an interesting point that I elided in my earlier discussion, which is just that even if the theistic proponent of the moral argument systematically proceeds through each and every one of the non-theistic accounts of morality and successfully refutes each and every one of them, their claim that God is required for morality still wouldn't follow. They would also need to show that we do indeed need an explanation for morality, right? Because there's yet a further option on the table, which is that there's some fundamental set of moral truths which don't have any further explanation. They would also need to rule that one out in order to say that God is needed to explain morality. And also something that I think David could have emphasized further was that when Craig responded to Kevin Sharp that merely listing these non-theistic accounts of morality doesn't show them to be good theories or plausible theories, that is just missing the relevant dialectical context. In the dialectical context at hand, Craig is the one who's claiming that under atheism there can be no objective morality, right? So the onus is on Craig to refute these other theories. The onus isn't on Kevin Sharp to say that these are good theories or plausible theories, or to show that they're true, or to even give positive reasons for them. If Craig wants to say that you can't have objective moral values and duties under atheism, then the onus is on him to systematically rule out each and every one of those non-theistic accounts. If he doesn't, then he hasn't adequately justified his claim that under atheism there can be no objective morality. So Craig just misses the fact that it is utterly irrelevant whether or not Kevin Sharp provides positive reasons for thinking that these non-theistic theories are good theories or plausible theories. That is totally irrelevant. The burden is not on Kevin Sharp to show that any of these are true or even plausible or what have you. The burden is on Craig to show that they're all false. If he doesn't show that, then he has not shown that you cannot have objective morality under atheism. So I think Craig has just thoroughly missed the point in his response to Kevin Sharp there. In my experience, that's a tactic that he uses quite often in debates. He kind of subtly shifts the burden of proof onto his opponents, when instead, he is the one who has to positively rule out their view in order for his arguments to succeed. This often happens, for instance, in the context of the Kalam cosmological argument, when someone raises to him the objection from Platonism. According to Platonism, there are actual infinities of abstract objects, and oftentimes he'll just say, well, there isn't positive reason to believe Platonism, like what's the evidence for Platonism and so on. He's thereby neglecting the fact that he is the one who's claiming that there cannot be actual infinites. So the onus is on him to rule out Platonism, according to which there are actual infinites. So whenever you're listening to Craig, be on the lookout for these illicit burden-shifting maneuvers. All right, on to mistake number 110, being far too hasty in mounting evolutionary debunking arguments against non-theistic accounts of moral knowledge. Okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful. Here's background on this. The guiding idea behind evolutionary debunking arguments is that we lack moral knowledge, at least under naturalism. We lack moral knowledge under naturalism because under naturalism, our moral intuitions and our evaluative dispositions, that is, our dispositions to evaluate certain acts as good or bad or right or wrong or etc., we lack moral knowledge under naturalism because our moral intuitions and evaluative dispositions were selected for their adaptiveness rather than their truth. And that provides a defeater for our beliefs based on those intuitions and dispositions. Now, in this context, a defeater for your belief B is a true proposition that, when added to your beliefs, would remove your justification for B. And the relevant evolutionary defeater might be that, hey, our moral beliefs easily could have been mistaken. Like, had we evolved slightly differently, we would have thought, for instance, that killing and eating our young was perfectly morally respectable. And maybe the fact that our moral beliefs easily could have been mistaken, maybe that provides an undercutting defeater for our moral beliefs. All of these claims here are immensely contentious, by the way, within epistemology and metaethics and so on. I'm just giving background of what the argument is. Maybe the relevant evolutionary defeater is that our moral beliefs are not appropriately sensitive to the truth, right? Like, even if the moral truths had been different, right, our beliefs would not have been correspondingly different. So we're not really sensitive to the truth in that kind of way. Our moral beliefs aren't really tracking the truth, right? Because, like, even if it was morally good to rape, torture, and murder people, that was not adaptive, evolutionarily speaking, and so we still would have evolved the moral beliefs that these things are bad and not to be done. And so our beliefs don't really track moral reality under naturalistic atheism, so the thought goes. And again, this is thought to provide a defeater for our moral beliefs. An alternative evolutionary defeater might be that our moral beliefs aren't explained by the truth of the moral propositions believed, right? So instead, our moral beliefs are explained by various evolutionary factors together with perhaps certain sociocultural factors, and maybe those aren't like appropriately explanatorily connected to the truth of the moral propositions that we believe, and maybe that kind of explanatory connection is a necessary condition on knowledge. Anyway, there are lots of potential candidates for what the evolutionary defeater might be, but again, this is just giving you a background. The guiding idea, in short, is that under naturalism, we don't have moral knowledge because our intuitions and evaluative dispositions were simply selected for their adaptiveness instead of their truth. And so our beliefs that are based on those intuitions and dispositions are going to be correspondingly undercut. And so we lack moral knowledge under naturalistic atheism. So the argument goes. Okay, that's all background. Here's the explanation of the mistake, okay? The mistake was being far too hasty in mounting these sorts of arguments. I'm not saying that these arguments fail, and I'm not saying that it's a mistake to mount them, okay? Instead, the point that I want to highlight is that sometimes some people are far too hasty in mounting such arguments, in that such people overlook, like, the thousands of papers and books on this topic. As a result of this work, a number of proposed solutions to the evolutionary challenge have emerged that, 1, don't require God, 2, if successful, account for our having more knowledge, and 3, don't just render that knowledge a mere matter of luck. To take just 4 examples of publications on this matter that immediately came to mind when writing the script, you can check out William Fitzpatrick's chapter, Why There is No Darwinian Dilemma for Ethical Realism, in Michael Bergman and Pat Kane's edited volume Challenges to Moral and Religious Belief, Disagreement and Evolution. And also, lots of Fitzpatrick's papers are available in these 2 links here that are in the resource document in the description. He has tons of other papers on this evolutionary challenge and responding to it on behalf of moral realists without appeal to God. Secondly, check out David Enoch's Taking Morality Seriously, A Defense of Robust Realism, Chapter 7. Check out Michael Humer's Ethical Intuitionism, Chapter 8. Check out Ryan Bartle's 2023 PhD dissertation, Defending Normative Realism Against Evolutionary Debunking Arguments. And for more such publications, it's easy to check Phil Papers or Academia or JSTOR or Google Scholar. As I said, there's tons of literature on these sorts of arguments. Indeed, something that's interesting. Some philosophers actually argue that it's actually theism which results in normative skepticism or moral skepticism. That is an undermining of our moral beliefs. You can see, for example, Sharon Street's chapter, If Everything Happens for a Reason, Then We Don't Know What Reasons Are, Why the Price of Theism is Normative Skepticism, in the aforementioned Bergman-Kane volume up here. One basic idea behind these sorts of arguments, among other guiding ideas, is that if we don't know that some things are just intrinsically impermissible, such as allowing someone to be tortured, raped, and then subsequently dismembered to death, even though one has the power and means to prevent it, well then that starts to undercut our moral knowledge more generally, since such claims seem as secure as any other moral claims. And yet theism requires denying such a claim, since God allows precisely that, and God, of course, cannot do anything impermissible. To be clear, I am not saying that this sort of argument succeeds. Let me repeat that. I am not saying that this sort of argument succeeds. My sole point is that the atheist isn't the only one with normative or moral skeptical challenges to address. I'm just cautioning us not to be hasty in mounting evolutionary debunking arguments against naturalistic atheism. Not only are there lots of, at least prima facie, defensible responses to them within the literature, but also there are similar skeptical challenges that theists themselves also have to address. And I actually think the same point afflicts Christians even more pungently. For instance, it seems deeply plausible, to many of us at least, that whatever else perfect goodness is, something that's perfectly good wouldn't drown innocent babies in a worldwide or even local flood, or command someone to sacrifice their child, or sanction the mauling of 42 young boys, which is deeply psychologically traumatic and permanently disfiguring, just because of some insults, and so on. If these moral intuitions are undermined, as Christian theism seems to require, setting aside pretty revisionary views of the Bible, well then it's hard to see how we can trust our moral intuitions more generally, right? Since these moral intuitions seem as secure as any other moral intuitions. At least, they seem that way to me. So the Christian theist especially must also face the threat of moral skepticism. Again, I'm not claiming here that moral epistemological arguments for theism fail. So I'm not claiming that these evolutionary debunking arguments, in other words, fail. I'm simply cautioning against how lots of internet folk have hastily employed the arguments, or should I say, weaponized the arguments. By the way, there's also a closely related problem for specifically Christian defenders of the moral argument, one which I mentioned in my video, Moral Arguments for God and Analysis, but also one which Non-Alchemist covers nicely and briefly here. Craig's moral argument will backfire. And in fact, let's play a little bit of that.
Regardless, there is an interesting problem that arises for conservative Christians who want to spam the moral argument. Namely, that placing so much emphasis on it ironically opens the floodgates to a variety of powerful objections to their beliefs. First, let's discuss the argument. So, here it is. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore, God exists. Right off the bat, I think there are good reasons to doubt premise 1. Let's assume premise 2 is correct, for the sake of argument. Anyway, what I really want to do is draw attention to how the second premise is defended. After all, how do we know that objective moral values and duties actually exist in the first place?
What reason would we have to believe that objective moral values and duties exist? Well, basically, it would be our moral experience. Just as we believe in the world of sense objects around us, physical objects, because we have a sense of them through our senses, so we can believe in the objective reality of moral values and duties on the basis of our moral experience. In the absence of some reason to defeat your experiences, you're justified in believing in what those experiences teach you.
Basically, for many people, it overwhelmingly seems like there are stance-independent moral truths, and that's a good reason to believe that there are until adequate defeaters are presented. I actually have no quibbles with this, and think the real debate should be about whether things like evolutionary debunking arguments and the like succeed in defeating these initial appearances for those who have them. But regardless of whether you agree, this is how Craig is thinking. He's saying it's totally fine to go with your moral experience unless you have a reason not to. But here's the problem for conservative Christians specifically. Once they let this kind of reasoning in, and boy have they, it can be employed with devastating force against the collection of counterintuitive moral monstrosities that make up some of their theology. If they can believe that our moral faculties are generally reliable enough to deduce the existence of objective morality in the first place, then surely one could believe they are generally reliable enough to denounce divinely sanctioned genocide. If they want people to take arguments from moral seeming seemings seriously when they use them, then they probably shouldn't poo-poo the moral seemings of others when they, question the ethics of slavery in the Old Testament. My point in bringing this up isn't to go on another long tirade about Old Testament ethics, but rather to make the point that when it comes to moral arguments, conservatives can't have their cake and eat it too. If it really seems to me that X can be a good reason for you to believe something, dear conservative Christian, then there is no principled reason why it can't be a good reason for someone else to doubt the beliefs that you hold. Craig really doesn't seem to understand this and sometimes puts himself in comical positions.
This encapsulates a lot of the progressive arguments against penal substitution that I see, in that they're saying essentially God submitted to what we wanted. In fact, I remember asking a progressive pastor this once: why did Jesus need to die if his sacrifice wasn't substitutionary? Why did he have to die? And I remember the pastor saying to me, well, it's because we wanted our pound of flesh and then God gave it to us, but it wasn't something he was requiring. And so I'd love to get your response to this quote: God did not kill Jesus, human culture and civilization did.
Well, let me say first that the opinion that your pastor expressed is an abominable view of God. That God would do unjust actions like allow some innocent person to be killed, to allow somebody else to have his pound of flesh. What sort of deity does this man worship? That's really horrific.
This is too easy. Just look at how disgusted he is at this pastor's suggestion.
I remember asking a progressive pastor this once, but it wasn't something he was requiring. And so I'd love to get your response to this quote: God did not kill Jesus, human...
An abominable view. That's really horrific.
Yeah, that's revolting, but somehow Craig's views aren't. He literally believes that an innocent was tortured to death and experienced punishment for the sake of others, and that all of this was orchestrated by a perfectly just God. Really? Craig has also defended the morality of killing children, at least in the context of the destruction of the Canaanites.
So, whom does God wrong in this situation is my question. He doesn't wrong the adults because they deserved judgment, they deserved destruction. He doesn't wrong the children because God has the right to take and give life as he wants to, and it actually results in better situation for the children. The only people that I could think of that he would wrong in doing this would be the Israeli soldiers themselves, who had to carry out such awful things.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, they had to go in and kill these people, and that would be brutalizing and dehumanizing to do such a thing.
After reflecting on this, I just keep thinking,
what sort of deity does this man worship? That's really horrific.
Craig is a smart guy, but he often has some pretty big double standards.
All right, mistake number 111. Intrinsic value or dignity proves God's existence. So... no, once we grant that there is indeed something about creatures themselves that gives them value, that is, once we grant that they have intrinsic value, right, they have value in and of themselves, there's something about them that accounts for their value, well, then it's not at all clear why we must appeal to God in addition, right? We've essentially granted that values wouldn't be deprived from reality if God is removed from the picture, since creatures do indeed have some value in virtue of their own features, right? That's just what it is to have intrinsic value. And what features might those be? Well, it might be perhaps their rationality, or maybe their sentience, or maybe their consciousness, or maybe their free will, or maybe their capacity for relationships, or maybe their reasons responsiveness, or what have you. We're not going to get into that here. But my point is just like that's just what intrinsic value is. It's value had by something in virtue of the way it is in itself. This is, of course, compatible with also having value in virtue of some extrinsic relation to God. But the point, though, is that once we grant the intrinsic grounding, it's not at all clear why we would then need to posit God in addition to account for creaturely value. At the very least, it seems to me quite clear that the mere fact that having intrinsic value or dignity does not require God's existence. On to mistake number 112. Non-theistic accounts can't explain why human morality is different from animal behavior, and so they're arbitrary in applying morality to human behavior but not animal behavior. More precisely, such accounts can't offer an explanation for why we appropriately blame, praise, hold accountable, punish, etc. humans for their behavior, but not, for example, chimpanzees. Okay, I think this is a mistake. As I say here, this is just wrong. There are pretty compelling non-theistic explanations for why human morality is different from the social behavior of animals. The question here is, why do we appropriately blame, praise, hold accountable, punish, etc. humans for their behavior, but not chimpanzees? Well, the explanation is that humans have various morally relevant intrinsic features that non-human animals lack. In particular, humans have the capacity to understand, deliberate on, act upon, and regulate their behavior in light of reasons. Animals aren't sensitive to the range of reasons bearing on their actions, and this explains, at least in large part, why they aren't morally culpable for their actions. They can't be held accountable since they can't be privy to the range of specifically moral reasons counting for or against their actions. But humans are different, right? We have various intrinsic rational capacities, like capacities to apprehend and base our actions on reasons. This means that we're liable to praise and blame if we act for bad reasons or overlook good reasons. Of course, together with meeting other certain intrinsic conditions, like having free will or etc., but anyway. But still, none of this cites God, as I say here. It's a perfectly kosher explanation of the difference between human morality and animal behavior in terms of our inherent capacities as the kind of beings that we are. So honestly, I think this mistake is just utterly bizarre in my view, but... Now, the objection also alleges that the non-theist's inability to explain the difference between human morality and animal behavior makes non-theistic morality arbitrary. But on the contrary, it's precisely the theistic view which, by my lights, suffers from arbitrariness here. Or like God either has some reason for endowing us with a relevant form of dignity or worth or value that specially sets us apart from non-human animals, or he doesn't. If he doesn't, then our having that dignity is arbitrary, since God has no reason at all for endowing it upon us. By contrast, if he does have such a reason, say because of the intrinsic features of humans, like the previously mentioned rational capacities, then it's quite plausibly that very reason which accounts for our having dignity or worth or value. And God is simply serving as an intermediary here. At the very least, the non-theist will then have a perfectly adequate account of our dignity or worth or value simply by citing that reason. And the charge that atheism cannot account for dignity or worth or value seems, by my lights, to vanish. So then, it seems to me that either theism suffers from arbitrariness, or else the non-theist has an account of the phenomenon, contrary to the objection at hand. So I really do think this is kind of a cluster of mistakes here. But onwards we march to mistake number 113, theists objecting to certain non-theistic accounts of morality on the basis that they ultimately land in brute, unexplained facts. Now, someone brought this objection up in the case of Bengtson, Cuneo, and Schaefer-Landau's non-theistic grounding for morality in their Mind article on the source of normativity, the one that I was talking about earlier in this video, by appeal to essentialist facts concerning moral properties. So like facts about what it is to be good or bad or right or wrong, etc. The problem with this objection is that theism doesn't seem to be in any better position, right? It too lands in brute, unexplained facts in its account of morality, right? Consider this. God is good. Why? What explains God's goodness? In virtue of what is God good? At least by my lights, there are only three plausible answers here. First, you could say that the explanation for why God is good is that God is loving and kind and just, and that these attributes or these kinds of attributes make God good. But the non-theist can then make the same move, right? What makes certain acts and states of affairs good? Well, their lovingness, their kindness, their justice, and so forth. Both accounts end in the same sort of explanation, and so theism seems to enjoy, by my lights, no explanatory advantage here. So that's the first option. The second option is that they might say that God is good by nature, like just what it is to be God is to be good. But then if they go this route, then they've just cited an essence fact as the ultimate explanatory stopping point for morality. They're just appealing to facts about what it is to be God, right? But that's precisely the same thing that Bengtson, Cuneo, and Schaefer-Landau do in their non-theistic grounding of morality. So once again, theism enjoys no explanatory advantage here. Thirdly, of course, they could just say that, well, okay, fine, there's no explanation for God's goodness. But then they're saddled with primitive unexplained normativity, or at least one unexplained moral fact, and hence they have no ultimate ground for morality as such. Their explanatory stopping point in explaining other moral facts would itself be a moral fact, namely that God is good. And so they haven't even given a grounding for morality as such. By contrast, Bengtson, Cuneo, and Schaefer-Landau cite non-normative, non-moral facts to ground the fundamental normative moral principles and moral facts, and hence they do supply a grounding for morality. And moreover, of course, it's hardly an objection to their account that essence facts are themselves primitive if the theistic account itself likewise ends in primitivity or bruteness. Okay, mistake number 114, confusing normative judgments with meta-ethical judgments. Sometimes you'll hear people say that if you don't believe in moral realism, that is, if you don't believe that there are objective or stance-independent moral truths, that is, truths about what's good or bad or right or wrong that are true independently of our beliefs, preferences, desires, and attitudes and other stances, well then you don't think that the Holocaust was wrong, or you don't think there's anything wrong with baby torture, etc. But that's just clearly mistaken, right? Simply because someone rejects that there are objective, stance-independent moral truths doesn't mean that they reject that there are any moral truths at all, right? One can still maintain that the Holocaust was wrong, that there is something wrong with baby torture and so on. It's just that they simply maintain that these aren't stance independently wrong. That is, wrong independently of anyone's beliefs, desires, attitudes, preferences, and other stances. So normative judgments are basically just judgments about what's good and bad and right and wrong, and other judgments as well, but that's kind of the salient class here. By contrast, metaethical judgments would be things like whether those first-order moral truths about what's good and bad and right or wrong, whether or not those obtain stance independently. That's a question about the nature of moral truths and so on, and that's a metaethical judgment rather than a normative judgment. The underlying point is that please don't confuse these two sorts of judgments. And then mistake number 115, the final mistake within the moral arguments category of this video. This mistake is ignoring the distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. According to relativism, the truth value of moral claims is indexed in some way or relative in some way. Maybe it's relative to societies or cultures and their views at large. Maybe it's relative to individuals' views or preferences or desires or something like that. But somehow the truth values of moral claims are relative in some way. Now, critiques of relativism often fail to distinguish appraiser and agent relativism. Agent relativism treats moral actions as right or wrong relative to the standards of the agent performing the action, or perhaps the culture of the agent performing the action. So that's agent relativism. Whether or not something is right or wrong for someone to do is relative to their standards, like the person who's actually performing the action. It's the agent who's doing the thing in question. That's what it is to which moral truths are relativized. By contrast, appraiser relativism treats moral claims as true or false relative to the person who's evaluating a moral claim or making a moral claim. So for instance, perhaps you think that torturing someone is wrong. And so you consider Jill, who is torturing Jack. Jill happens to think that it's perfectly fine to torture someone. Now, agent relativism, right? They treat moral actions as right or wrong relative to the standards of the agent performing the action, right? So according to agent relativism, Jill's torturing Jack really is going to be okay, right? Because whether or not it's right or wrong is relative to the standards of Jill, right? And according to Jill's standards, it's perfectly fine. But appraiser relativism does not have that quite nasty consequence, right? Instead, appraiser relativism treats moral claims as true or false relative to the person evaluating the moral claim or making the moral claim. So when you are the one who's judging that Jill, in doing the action, is doing something quite wrong, appraiser relativism does not imply that it's okay just because Jill thinks it's okay. No. The relevant moral claims are true or false relative to your standards, the one who's appraising the action in question. And since you think it's wrong, appraiser relativism is going to give the result that it's wrong, at least for you. And so at least in that regard, appraiser relativism does not have an incredibly nasty consequence that agent relativism does. Now, arguably there are other nasty consequences that appraiser relativism has, but we're not going to get into that. All too often, people just confuse agent and appraiser relativism in discussions about the moral argument and in objecting to relativistic views, so please don't make that confusion. And then finally, before getting into the fine-tuning section of this video, I've put together a list of some of the prominent criticisms of Craig-style moral arguments in the following document here. Again, you can find this document linked in the description. It's also in the resource document linked in the description. So yeah, anyway, here are some criticisms of Craig-style moral arguments. It's a 3 or 4 page document of lots of different criticisms, so check it out if you're interested. Alright, so on to the mistakes pertaining to fine-tuning, beginning with mistake number 116. Chance, design, physical necessity somehow avoids the issue of the expectation of the data on theism. This is really just shorthand for a mistake that I covered at the timestamp 3340 of my video here.
I was just going to say that this version actually has some benefits that not many people know about. And so there's one in particular I'm thinking about right now, which is in the other versions, like you see from Robin Collins and even I think Luke Barnes might be susceptible to this, is that there's this question in the problem of evil literature about skeptical theism. So skeptical theism is this idea that we can't really be confident about what God would do in this world in terms of like what he would allow, what kind of horrendous evils he would allow and whatnot. So there's this question of like how much do we really know about what God would intend or would do? And so this actually, if we think about that response to the problem of evil in terms of a response to these kind of design arguments, which seem to look at what God is intending to do with nature, then it would seem to actually cut both ways. So it would make us skeptical about these arguments from evil, but then it would also seem to make us skeptical about these arguments from design because we're not really sure what God's intentions are. But the reason why I'm even bringing this out and talking about this is because this version, I studied this a couple years back, and I discovered that this version by Craig is kind of clever because it doesn't actually involve that at all. It just says fine-tuning the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. Fine-tuning is not due to either chance or physical necessity, so fine-tuning is due to design. So what's sort of interesting about this version of the fine-tuning argument is that it avoids all those types of concerns, which is interesting. It's also Craig is very careful when he formulates his arguments because this is completely compatible with his views on the problem of evil and what he thinks we can.
So no, that's mistaken. Let's suppose we have the following scenario. So I give the first premise. the ticket that won the lottery is either ticket number 1, or it's ticket number 2, or it's ticket number 3, or it's ticket number 4, or, and so on throughout 100 million, let's say. But, this is my second premise, the ticket that won the lottery isn't number 2, and it also isn't number 3. Oh, and it's also not number 4. And it's also not number 5, and so I go through these individually. And why? Well, I say, oh, because each is individually enormously improbable. And so we have really good, strong reason to reject each of those individually. And then I can conclude from that ticket number 1 won. So ticket number 1, I can literally conclude that that's the one that's the winner. And I can do this even before the winner is chosen. Now, this is a patently absurd kind of reasoning. Just because you can do this disjunction and then go try to attack each disjunct apart from one of the disjuncts and try to reject them, you have to ask, do your objections against that also target the one disjunct that you're not leveling the objection toward? And you also have to see if there are additional problems afflicting the disjunct that you didn't target that don't inflict all those other disjuncts. So basically, it's a problem for the justification for the second premise. At least the justification for the second premise in relation to trying to rule out the other hypotheses in relation to the one that you're trying to favor. And so similarly, if Craig would go through and say, oh, well, it's not due to chance because that's enormously improbable. But of course, you could say the exact same thing with respect to his design hypothesis. You can talk about why that's super duper improbable. You can talk about the considerations that I just leveled with respect to there being infinitely many ways that God could secure the relevant goods that don't involve fine-tuning the physical universe and so on. Or you could raise considerations of saying, well, we don't even know what God would do given skeptical theism, and so that probability is inscrutable. And so it's actually in no better position than the chance hypothesis, because it's literally inscrutable what the probability would even be. And so the exact same style of objections that Craig is leveling to the chance hypothesis would equally be able to be leveraged toward the design hypothesis, such that you could equally justifiably say the fine-tuning of the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. It's not due to design, it's not due to physical necessity, therefore it's due to chance. So no, this isn't a benefit of Craig's argument. In fact, and I'm not accusing Craig of intentionally doing that, but if anything, it's subtly masking the deeper complexities. If anything, it's making it seem as though you can get a swifter inference to design than is actually required. And so in that sense, it's actually kind of deceptive. I'm saying that the argument is deceptive, not William Lane Craig, or not even his use of the argument. If this argument just popped into being uncaused, as Craig thinks is absurd, if this argument just popped into existence uncaused, it would still be a deceptive argument, just because it's like deceptively simple. So I'm not attributing bad intentions to anyone. My point is just that this argument is deceptive in that it hides these considerations that I've been bringing to the fore here. And so I think Cameron is wrong. Skeptical theism does attack this, because it shows that the way that Craig goes to try to rule out these hypotheses here for his second premise would equally apply to his design thing, such that we could equally well say fine-tuning is not due to design or physical necessity or whatever, or it's not due to design or chance, therefore it's due to physical necessity or whatever. Again, it's similar to the ticket argument that I was just giving. I say, hey, it's either 1 or number 2 or number 3 or number 4 or whatever throughout 100 million. But then I go through the various hypotheses and say, oh no, it's definitely not number 2. What? That's super duper improbable. That only has a 1 in 100 million chance. You're like 99.99999 whatever. Super duper confident that that isn't true. And so you're saying we could be really, really confident so we can rule that one out. And then you go through, you do the same thing with number 3, number 4, number 5, and then it follows logically and inescapably that ticket number 1 wins. No, that sort of reasoning is ludicrous. Why is that? Well, because the exact same justifications that you gave as to why you're ruling out number 2 and why you're ruling out number 3 and why you're ruling out number 4 would equally apply to your ticket number 1. And the same thing, as I've pointed out, goes for this justification that Craig offers on behalf of his second premise. There's no avoiding considerations of prior probability and considerations of the likelihood ratios. There's no avoiding the fact that skeptical theism might still bear on this sort of argument. I know what I said there wasn't super duper polished because that was off the cuff, but I'm sure you can forgive me. On to mistake number 117, the puddle analogy as a response to the fine-tuning argument. Or in other words, the selection effect response to the fine-tuning argument, or in other words, the basic appeal to the anthropic principle. There are different ways to fill out this sort of response to the fine-tuning argument, but most of them are deeply mistaken. One prominent way is that we couldn't have observed a universe that wasn't conducive to life, and so there's no need to explain why the universe is life-permitting. Given that we're here, there's simply no mystery as to why the universe is life-permitting. It clearly had to be, and so there's no need to explain the universe's fine-tuning for life. But this reasoning is just wrong, and there are lots of familiar counterexamples to it. The most famous comes from John Leslie in his 1989 book Universes. Suppose you are to be executed by 50 sharpshooters, shots ring out, and amazingly, you find that you're still alive despite hearing all those shots ring out. Of course, if you had died, you wouldn't be around to observe this, so you couldn't have observed the situation in which one or more of their bullets hit you. Even still, your survival obviously calls out for explanation and gives you evidence for certain explanatory hypotheses, for example, that the shooters intended to miss. So just because something obtaining is a necessary condition for your observing that it obtains, it does not follow that that thing does not call out for explanation, and it also doesn't follow that it provides no evidence for certain explanatory hypotheses. So in short, if this reasoning up here were successful, then it would also be successful in the sharpshooter case, and you'd be able to justifiably conclude that there's no need to explain why the 50 sharpshooters missed you. But since that's absurd, it follows that this reasoning up here does not succeed. Alright, mistake number 118, naive frequentism in the context of a fine-tuning argument. So many times I've seen internet atheists appeal to a super-duper naive kind of frequentism in response to the fine-tuning argument. I think the idea is that we only have one universe and set of constants and initial conditions to go off in our probability judgments. And so the probability of our universe's constants and initial conditions having the values that they do is just 1 out of 1, or 100%. And so it's not data that's like more expected on one hypothesis over another, and so it's not going to count as evidence for theism over atheism. But this is a mistake. Much of science would be pretty much impossible if this sort of naive frequentism were true. Like, hey, we only have one dinosaur extinction to go off of, and so the probability of the dinosaur extinction is 1 out of 1, or 100%, and so it's not data that's more expected on one hypothesis, say asteroid impact, over another hypothesis, say aliens did it. No. That's just not how things work. We can make predictions concerning data where that data is a single, unique, unrepeatable event. And that's because when we're confirming hypotheses and gaining evidential confirmation or disconfirmation of them, the relevant notion of probability at play is what's called epistemic or evidential probabilities, which are just measures of the degree to which some fact supports another fact. And even if the relevant piece of data is just the fact that some one-off event occurred, that fact can still be more likely or more expected or more probable under certain hypotheses than it is under other hypotheses. Suppose it really was the case that the stars in the night sky spelled out the first 14 verses of John in perfect Koine Greek. Suppose that really did happen in the sky. Like, we're not being deceived, no one's pulling a prank on us. Suppose that really did happen. And suppose, furthermore, that this is just a one-off event. Now, it would be clearly ludicrous for someone to say, well, we only have one arrangement of stars to go off of. This is a one-off event, so its probability is just 1 out of 1. It's 100%. And so this isn't evidence for Christianity. It's like, please stop. In general, both science and history study one-off events all the time, and we can compare various hypotheses in terms of how well they predict or how well they lead us to expect those one-off events. And since there can be differing levels of expectation there, since one hypothesis can render it more expected or more likely or more probable that that one-off event would occur than alternative hypotheses, we can gain evidence for the former over the latter. Mistake number 119, bad responses to the multiverse objection to the fine-tuning argument. Of course, don't get me wrong, there are some good responses, in the sense of very well thought out, not clearly mistaken responses to the multiverse objection to the fine-tuning argument, such as the allegation that it commits the inverse gambler's fallacy. I'm not saying here that that's a successful response, but it's at least well thought out, and it's not, like, obviously mistaken. And as I say here, I'm not actually convinced that the inverse gambler's fallacy charge does succeed, largely for the reasons that philosopher Neil Manson articulates in his 2022 Philosophy Compass article. But my point is just that it's an objection, again, that should be taken seriously. But there are some responses to the multiverse objection that do belong on such a list, and let's go through those next. So one is just like, oh, it's so speculative, the multiverse, it's untestable. But this is a bad response. First, it's not any more speculative than theism. So if this objection works against the multiverse response, it would also impugn theism's credentials as an alleged explanation of fine-tuning. Second, it's well known and even granted by many professional theist philosophers writing on this topic that there are arguments from physics and cosmology for a multiverse, some of which Sean Carroll has popularized, and there are also well-developed and, in principle, testable multiverse models within physics. So it's not merely some highfalutin, ungrounded, untestable speculation. But more fundamentally, the whole point of the multiverse objection, or perhaps more accurately, the whole point of one version of the multiverse objection, is that the fine-tuning data is actually pretty expected on that hypothesis. And since it's far less expected on the negation of that hypothesis, the fine-tuning data is going to be significant evidence for the multiverse hypothesis, and the charge of being speculative just drops by the wayside. I mean, like, again, the whole point is that we're proposing hypotheses in order to explain this piece of data and gaining evidential confirmation for those hypotheses by conditioning on that data. Another bad response to the multiverse objection is like, hey, there's no evidence for it. But first, and as just noted, there are some physical grounds for thinking a multiverse exists. Don't get me wrong, they're certainly not conclusive at this point in time, which is why there's no consensus among the relevant experts on this topic, but to say that there's no evidence simply betrays a lack of familiarity with physics. Second, the fine-tuning data itself has been argued to provide evidence for the multiverse. After all, if the multiverse hypothesis is true, on which the various universes within the multiverse ensemble vary in their initial conditions and constants, then it's practically guaranteed that some universe will be fine-tuned for life. The very fact that the hypothesis can explain an otherwise puzzling piece of data tells in its favor, and hence it's mistaken to say that there's no evidence for the hypothesis. Now, of course, keep in mind that there's a difference between explaining why some universe is fine-tuned and explaining why our universe is fine-tuned. For more on this point, again, see Neil Manson's article, Cosmic Fine-Tuning, the Multiverse Hypothesis, and the Inverse Gambler's Fallacy. That should be linked in the resource document, which is linked in the description, and you can also check out the discussion that I recently had with Philip Goff on my channel. Another bad response to the multiverse objection is that, well, hey, in positing this vast ensemble of universes, it's like way too complicated of a hypothesis. I don't think this is a good objection. So I do think the multiverse hypothesis does incur a cost in terms of quantitative parsimony, that is, the dimension of parsimony measured by the number of entities postulated. But importantly, the entities postulated are just more of the same kind of thing we already know to exist, namely universes and physical things. By contrast, whereas theism doesn't incur as large of a cost in terms of quantitative parsimony, since theism doesn't posit as many new entities as the multiverse response, theism incurs a huge cost in terms of qualitative parsimony, that is, the dimension of parsimony measured by the number of kinds of entities posited. Specifically, theism adds a radically different kind of thing into our ontology, namely a non-spatiotemporal, non-physical, unlimited supernatural mind. This is radically and categorically unlike anything else in reality. So, while theism enjoys an edge over the multiverse response in terms of quantitative parsimony, arguably theism is worse when it comes to qualitative parsimony. Now, it's not exactly clear which of these two kinds of parsimony should bear more weight, though it should be noted that more philosophers seem to think that qualitative parsimony matters more than quantitative parsimony. Still, though, the very fact that it may strike one as unclear which dimension of parsimony matters more here goes to show that the objection at hand hasn't pinpointed any unique disadvantage accruing to the multiverse hypothesis that doesn't also accrue to theism when it comes to explaining fine-tuning. Alright, on to mistake number 120, which is saying that the constants and initial conditions are just metaphysically necessary as a response to the fine-tuning argument. The hypothesis here is either the general, non-specific hypothesis that whatever the constants or initial conditions are, they're necessarily that way. Or else it's the highly specific hypothesis that it is metaphysically necessary that these precise constants obtain. Like in the latter case, our hypothesis builds in that these values here and here and here and here and so on are all metaphysically necessary. And for a list of some of these constants, you can check out this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry linked in the resource document. So again, the hypothesis here that the constants and initial conditions are metaphysically necessary is either a very general and non-specific hypothesis, which is just saying like, hey, whatever the constants and initial conditions are, they're necessarily that way, or it's the super-duper specific hypothesis, which is saying these precise constants that we do in fact have, like the 0.67, like all those ones that we do in fact have, those are all, it's metaphysically necessary that these precise constants obtain. If we have the general non-specific hypothesis, well then we haven't actually purchased any predictive power whatsoever with respect to predicting a life-permitting universe, right? The necessary constants and initial conditions are conceivably any of the physically meaningful values. And so merely saying that the constants and initial conditions are necessary won't boost the probability that specifically life-permitting constants and initial conditions are the metaphysically necessary ones, as opposed to the metaphysically necessary constants and initial conditions being non-life-permitting, or being any of the other conceivable array of values that they might have taken. The mere hypothesis that whatever the values are, they're metaphysically necessary, that doesn't actually tell us that the values are going to be falling within the precise life-permitting range. It only tells us that wherever they happen to fall, it's going to be metaphysically necessary that they be that way. But that general non-specific hypothesis alone is perfectly compatible with the constants falling in anywhere within the relevant range. It's just that wherever they're going to fall, according to the hypothesis, it's metaphysically necessary that they be in that particular place. But still, the hypothesis itself affords us no predictive resources with respect to the specific values that the constants and initial conditions might take on. The necessary constants and initial conditions could conceivably be any among the huge range of values, only a tiny portion of which are life-permitting. And so the epistemic probability that the constants would fall within the life-permitting range, conditional on this general non-specific hypothesis, is going to be basically just the same as the hypothesis that the values are set by chance. So again, we haven't purchased any predictive power whatsoever with this general non-specific hypothesis. By contrast, if we go with the highly specific hypothesis, That is the hypothesis that it's metaphysically necessary that these precise constants to obtain, like pointing to them, the ones that fall within the life-permitting range, well then yes, our hypothesis will definitely predict that our universe is life-permitting. In fact, our hypothesis assigns probability 1 to that. It entails it. It just builds it into the hypothesis from the get-go. But the problem is that we've now made our hypothesis ludicrously intrinsically improbable. In fact, so improbable that we haven't actually made any probabilistic headway overall, since we've decreased the intrinsic probability of our hypothesis to the same extent that the data was initially surprising on the general nonspecific hypothesis mentioned above. After all, there doesn't seem to be any antecedent reason to expect that the necessary values would be life-permitting ones as opposed to the far more numerous collection of non-life-permitting ones. That is, there doesn't seem to be any reason to expect this antecedent or prior to observing the relevant datum, namely that the values are indeed life-permitting. What we really have here is a case of likelihood ratio rigging, which is a mistake that we covered in the first part of this series. So basically what we've done is we've purchased predictive power at the cost of correspondingly lowering the intrinsic probability of our hypothesis, and so we haven't made probabilistic headway overall. This, fundamentally, is what is wrong with saying that the constants and initial conditions are just metaphysically necessary as a response to the fine-tuning argument. It's really a dilemma. This hypothesis is either the general nonspecific one, or else it's the highly specific one. If it's the general nonspecific one, then we actually haven't purchased any predictive power with respect to the datum. And so our hypothesis is just as bad as the chance hypothesis. By contrast, if the hypothesis is the highly specific one, well then while we've predicted the data, we've just correspondingly taken a massive hit in the intrinsic probability of our hypothesis. We have simply moved, rather than removed, the significant improbability. And what's more, as I say here, the very fact, if it is a fact, that these life-permitting constants and initial conditions are necessary can itself be wielded on behalf of a fine-tuning argument. For we can ask about how expected this very fact is on theism and atheism, namely, how expected is it that the constants and initial conditions that are necessary are ones that are life-permitting? And when we ask how expected this very fact is on theism and atheism, the proponent of the original fine-tuning argument will probably argue that for essentially the same reasons as in the original fine-tuning argument, this fact is much more surprising on atheism than it is on theism. So in the end, I think this is a mistaken response to the fine-tuning argument. That doesn't mean that there aren't any good responses to the fine-tuning argument, of course. It simply means that, in my view, this is not among them. By the way, if you actually want to get into good, substantive, sophisticated criticisms of the fine-tuning argument, one good place to start is the work of Neil Manson that I mentioned earlier. You can find his work by looking it up. We could cover many more mistakes here, but for purposes of time and space and sanity, we're going to move on to the mistakes pertaining to ontological arguments. So mistake number 121, ignoring the distinction between logical and metaphysical possibility and impossibility, and moreover, thinking that mere logical consistency or coherence entails metaphysical possibility. Those are mistakes. Do not ignore the distinction between logical and metaphysical possibility/impossibility, and also, mere logical consistency or coherence does not entail metaphysical possibility. Okay, so let's get clear on some of these terms. As philosophers in these debates generally understand it, logical possibility is simply a matter of formal consistency, that is, absence of contradiction. So the abstract form or structure of the relevant sentence, you can't derive a contradiction from it just by manipulating logical symbols. So, for instance, the following are all plausibly logically impossible. It is logically impossible that God both exists and doesn't exist. It's arguably logically impossible that there's a square circle, that is something that is both a square and a circle, and hence not a square, in the same respect and at the same time. It's also logically impossible that there's a set containing all and only those sets that don't contain themselves, right? Because this set either contains itself or it doesn't. If it does contain itself, well then it's among those sets that don't contain themselves. So it doesn't contain itself, right? So if it does contain itself, then it doesn't. But if the set doesn't contain itself, well, again, it contains all those sets that don't contain themselves. So it must contain itself. In which case it contains itself, right? So if it does contain itself, then it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it does. And since it either does or it doesn't, either way we get a contradiction. Now, all of these involve some kind of formal inconsistency or contradictoriness. They're either a claim of the form P and not P, or else they logically entail a claim of that form, perhaps given the meanings of the non-logical terms involved. To be logically possible, then, is simply to be free of any strict formal contradiction. In the case of a logically possible claim, no contradiction can be derived from the truth of the claim. And in the case of a logically possible entity, or property, or state of affairs, or event, no contradiction can be derived from the existence of that entity, or the instantiation of that property, or the obtaining of that state of affairs, or the occurrence of that event. By contrast, metaphysical possibility is quite difficult to define, and usually examples help convey it best. But it's just a matter of what really genuinely could have existed in reality. Think about it in terms of like what is actualizable, like what really could have been actual. So for instance, it's metaphysically impossible for the number 3 to cook a sandwich. That just couldn't happen. And it's also metaphysically impossible for water to be anything other than H2O. But clearly, right, there's nothing logically inconsistent or contradictory about water being H3O or being a simple element, right? Aristotle, for instance, wasn't contradicting himself when he said that water is a basic element. This shows that metaphysical possibility has to respect not just logical consistency, but also the natures of the things involved, right? Water is essentially H2O. What it is to be water is to be H2O. Like anything with a different chemical compound just wouldn't be water. Water being H3O is a logical possibility, right? Like, you can't derive a formal contradiction from the claim that water is H3O. It's not strictly contradictory, and so it's logically possible. But it's not metaphysically possible, since that conflicts with the essence or nature of water. What this helps illustrate is that merely from the fact that something is consistent or not contradictory, we cannot conclude that it's thereby metaphysically possible. That is, that it genuinely could exist in reality. Countless things are logically consistent but not metaphysically possible. For example, me being a poached egg, water being H3O, the number 3 cooking a sandwich, the goodness of intentionally inflicting horrific, prolonged suffering on an innocent child just for the sake of some slight kicks and giggles on your end, and so on. Metaphysical modality, and modality, by the way, is just like possibility and necessity. So like metaphysical possibility and necessity are often explicated in terms of possible worlds. You can think of a possible world as a complete, comprehensive, or total way that reality could be, down to every last detail. Something is metaphysically possible when it's true or exists in some possible world. That is, some comprehensive way that reality genuinely could be. And something is metaphysically necessary when it's true or exists in every possible world. That is, every comprehensive way that reality could be. Finally, something is metaphysically impossible when it's true or exists in no possible worlds. But anyway, back to the point that logical coherence or consistency doesn't imply metaphysical possibility. Here's why this matters. The simplest way to put the modal ontological argument is as follows, where the relevant modal notions at play are metaphysical possibility. Premise 1 is that God's existence is possible. Premise 2 is that God's existence is either necessary or impossible. The idea is that if there were to be a God, God would be a necessary being. And so God's going to have to either exist in all possible worlds or no possible worlds. He's going to have to be either necessary or he's going to have to be impossible. And so if God is possible, well then he's not impossible, and hence, since he's either necessary or impossible, and he's not impossible, it follows that God's existence is necessary. Again, that's roughly speaking the simplest way to put the modal ontological argument. But notice, crucially, that showing that there's nothing strictly contradictory about God is not enough to justify premise 1. Again, mere logical possibility doesn't entail metaphysical possibility, and so doesn't entail that first premise. We're going to need something more than mere coherence to accept premise 1. And of course, it's pretty easy to find various non-theistic hypotheses which are also logically coherent. And so, if mere coherence were enough to support possibility, we could equally motivate the reverse possibility premise in the exact same fashion. The reverse possibility premise, by the way, says that God's non-existence is possible. And of course, if God's non-existence is possible, well then God's existence isn't necessary, right? Because his non-existence is possible. And so, since God's existence is not necessary, and since it's either necessary or impossible, it's going to follow that God is impossible, and hence God doesn't exist. And so as a supplemental point here, it's pretty easy to find various non-theistic hypotheses which are also logically coherent. And so, again, if mere coherence were enough to support possibility, we could equally motivate the reverse possibility premise in the exact same fashion. Alas, I'm getting ahead of myself here since I'll be covering the reverse modal ontological argument pretty soon. Anyway, the fundamental point here is, don't confuse logical possibility and metaphysical possibility. And don't think you can show that something is metaphysically possible simply because it's logically possible. That is, simply because it's coherent and no contradiction can be derived from it. I'll close here with philosopher Daniel Rubio, who is a theist, mind you, making essentially the same point. Oh, and by the way, the continuum hypothesis, which Rubio is going to mention in the video clip that I'm about to play from the Analytic Christian, the continuum hypothesis is the hypothesis that there's no set whose cardinality is strictly between that of the integers and the real numbers. In other words, there's no set whose size, or there's no set whose number of elements is strictly between the size of the set of the integers and the size of the set of the real numbers. That's what the continuum hypothesis says.
Let me keep playing the video.
Before you do that, I have a second round of comments on the,
go
argument.
go for it.
This one on the way they use the idea of coherence to defend what I would call the possibility premise. So the connection between logical coherence and existing in a possible world, which is the sort of notion that they use when they're trying to defend the possibility of God existing, is a good case in point for keeping the metaphysical and semantic devices separate. As critics of this argument, or metaphysicians arguing for metaphysical theses in general have observed, it's pretty normal for incompatible theses or things to both be logically coherent, even when those things or theses purport to be necessary truths or necessary existence. We can see this uncontroversially in mathematics. So take the continuum hypothesis. There's nothing incoherent about the continuum hypothesis. So by the logic of the video, the continuum hypothesis is true at some possible world. Now take the negation of the continuum hypothesis. There's also nothing incoherent about the negation of the continuum hypothesis. The fact that the continuum hypothesis is independent of the standard axioms of mathematics is proof of both coherence claims. So by the logic of the video, the negation of the continuum hypothesis is true in some possible world. But mathematical truths are only true if they are necessarily true. So by the logic of the video, both the continuum hypothesis and its negation are true. And of course, that can't be. That's a contradiction. Metaphysicians' worlds are more demanding. You've got to choose one or the other to be possible. Since both are coherent, mere coherence isn't good enough. Gounod-style parodies are not the biggest problem for modal ontological arguments. Here's the biggest problem for arguments like this. Just like the concept of God seems coherent, but like we'll hedge here for apophatic concerns, worries about the limits of human cognition, like those are all real difficulties, even in saying I think that our concept of God is coherent. Possibilities that exclude God also seem coherent. It seems perfectly coherent that there be nothing at all, or that there be an endless ocean full of pink shrimp. No God in either of these possibilities. But now the ontological argument can be thrown in reverse. If the nothing world, or the shrimp-only world, is genuinely possible, it looks like God is out of business. We have to choose which of our coherent possibilities to embrace and which to discard. And so far, no one has given a convincing reason to discard the one or the other.
What the Rubio video highlights, too, is that this isn't just a mistake committed by internet people, it's also a mistake committed by philosophers like William Lane Craig. By the way, Rubio was responding to Craig's animated video on the modal ontological argument there, where Craig quite blatantly makes this mistake. Onwards we march, though, to mistake number 122, ignoring the distinction between epistemic and metaphysical possibility and impossibility. Once more, we're going to be looking at a little clip from a video here.
The argument that we're talking about here is indeed cast in terms of metaphysical possibility. We're not saying like, oh, for all I know, God might exist, or for all I know, God might not exist. No, we're saying premise one is that it's metaphysically possible. There is some possible world, some way that reality could be such that God exists. And then from there, you do get the God necessarily exists. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is one of the first weaknesses, or rather kind of ways that the rug gets pulled under people, is that when you ask them to accept the first premise, it's possible that God exists. Most people say, yeah, I can agree with that in the sense of epistemic humility. Like, yeah, sure, it's possible that God exists. But that's not, we have to be careful to specify that we're talking about metaphysical possibility, right? So for example, if you're somebody who thinks, if you think to yourself, well, yeah, I mean, I think it's possible that God exists, that means God must exist. Like, that doesn't seem right. Like, if you are of the mind, if when you say you think God possibly exists, you mean it in the sense of saying, well, possibly God exists, possibly God doesn't exist, I don't know. That's not the kind of possibility that we need for this argument to work. If you are talking about metaphysical possibility, and you say, well, it's possible that necessarily God exists, it's possible that necessarily he doesn't, it's like, no, you can't have both at the same time. It's one or the other. So one of the ways that I think, one of the first mistakes I think that a lot of people make is they kind of go, well, yeah, I mean, the first premise seems reasonable. It's possible that God exists. But there are different types of possibility, as Joe very helpfully spelled out. And so if you're just thinking, epistemically speaking, like, yeah, it could be true, don't worry, that doesn't quite commit you to the conclusion. But if you think it's metaphysically possible, then unfortunately you are committed.
So yeah, that's the mistake. All too often, people think the possibility premise, the modal ontological argument, is true because they think that, for all they know, God might exist. That is, nothing in their knowledge base rules out God's existence. But that's epistemic possibility, or something like it, right? That's totally different from whether there's some way that reality could be such that God exists. That is, it's totally different from whether God's existence is metaphysically possible. Right, consider again the continuum hypothesis from earlier. It's epistemically possible for us right now that it's true, and it's also epistemically possible that it's false. For all we know, it might be true, and it also might be false. But importantly, only one of those epistemic possibilities is actually metaphysically possible, since the continuum hypothesis is either true or false, and whichever truth value it has, it's going to be metaphysically necessary that it has that particular truth value, since mathematical claims aren't plausibly contingent. Instead, when they're true, they're metaphysically necessarily true, and when they're false, they're metaphysically necessarily false. And what this illustrates is that something can easily be epistemically possible, even though it isn't metaphysically possible, since the truth and falsehood of the continuum hypothesis are each epistemically possible, even though only one of them is metaphysically possible. And just more generally, it's useful to distinguish different sorts of possibility. The following are only rough glosses, and much more precision could be given here. I'm just trying to give you guys a basic but still mostly accurate understanding of the different sorts of possibility that philosophers distinguish among. Knowing about these distinctions is an incredibly powerful tool for your philosophical toolkit. So we got logical possibility, metaphysical possibility, epistemic possibility, etc. So logical possibility, roughly, P is logically possible when no contradiction can be derived from P, perhaps given the meanings of the non-logical expressions in P. So actually, unfortunately, logical possibility is characterized differently by different philosophers. Sometimes logical possibility is used in the following sense. P is logically possible when no contradiction can be derived from P given the meanings of the non-logical expressions in P. That's one way to cash it out. Another way to cash out logical possibility is just to say that P is logically possible when no contradiction can be derived from P. In that case, in attempting to derive a contradiction from P, you're not allowed to take as given the meanings of the non-logical expressions in P. Instead, you're only allowed to take into account the kind of formal, abstract, logical structure of P itself, of the sentence itself. So that's logical possibility. There's also metaphysical possibility, right? Right, P is metaphysically possible when there's some comprehensive way that reality genuinely could be, such that P is true. What about epistemic possibility? Well, for some subject S, P is epistemically possible for S when nothing that S knows rules out P's truth. That is, P is basically compatible with everything that S knows. Creedal possibility, right? This refers to credences or degrees of confidence. So for some subject S, P is creedally possible for S when S's actual credence in P is greater than 0. So basically, creedal possibility is a matter of not being absolutely certain in the falsity of the thing in question. Right, so long as you're not absolutely certain that P is false, well then P is going to be creedally possible for you. You basically think that there's at least some, perhaps even remote, chance that it's the case. There's also rational creedal possibility, right? So for some subject S, P is rationally creedally possible for S when the rational credence for S to have in P, given S's evidence, is greater than 0. So basically, relative to you and relative to your evidence base, something is rationally creedally possible when your evidence makes it have a non-zero probability. There's also doxastic possibility, right? So doxa, I think that's Greek for belief. Doxastic possibility. So for some subject S, P is doxastically possible for S when P is compatible with everything that S believes. There's also physical possibility, right? So P is physically possible when it's metaphysically possible given the actual laws of nature, right? So in other words, the actual laws of nature allow for it to be true. So basically, P is true in some metaphysically possible world that shares in common with the actual world the actual laws of nature. And there are many more besides, such as technological possibility and psychological possibility, etc. There are so many different kinds of possibility, so always be incredibly careful when possibility and necessity come up in philosophical discussions. Really try to get clear with your interlocutor, your dialectical partner, what you guys are meaning in the relevant context by possibility and necessity. Do you mean mere logical possibility, like a mere matter of coherence, a mere matter of not being able to strictly derive a formal contradiction? Do you mean metaphysical possibility? Do you mean epistemic possibility? What do you mean? Physical possibility, etc. All right, mistake number 123, presenting the modal ontological argument while being totally oblivious to the reverse modal ontological argument. In short, you are being incredibly negligent if you present the modal ontological argument as a successful argument for God's existence without presenting, discussing, or addressing the reverse modal ontological argument. Here's how that argument goes, drawing from a previous video of mine.
The core idea behind the argument is that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter. Either it's necessary that God exists, or it's impossible that God exists. The idea is that were God to exist, God would be a necessary being. And so he either spans all possible worlds, or he spans no possible worlds. If he exists in any possible world, then he's going to have to exist in all possible worlds. And likewise, if he doesn't exist in some possible world, then he doesn't exist in any possible world.
So God's existence is either going to be necessary, he's either going to span all possible worlds, all comprehensive or total ways that reality could be, or else he's going to be impossible, he's going to span no possible worlds. So given that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter, given that God's existence is either necessary or impossible, if it's possible that God exists, well then clearly it's not impossible that God exists, and hence it's going to have to be necessary that God exists. And then of course it follows that God actually exists. This, in short, is the simplest way to present the modal ontological argument. Now, is this a proof of God's existence? Definitely not. Yes, if we grant that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter, and if we grant the background system of modal logic, then either it's necessary that God exists, or it's impossible that God exists. So under those assumptions, the second premise of the argument is on good footing. The problem, though, is that there's an equally compelling reverse modal ontological argument, whose conclusion is incompatible with the conclusion of the modal ontological argument. In particular, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, if God's non-existence is possible, then it follows that God's existence is not necessary, right? If God's non-existence is possible, if it's possible that God doesn't exist, then clearly God's existence is not absolutely necessary. And so from 1 and 2, we can conclude that God's existence is impossible, right? Because if God's non-existence is possible, then God's existence isn't necessary, and hence God's existence is going to have to be impossible. So, from the mere possibility that God doesn't exist, we can infer that God is impossible. And of course, from that, it follows that God actually doesn't exist. And we therefore have two seemingly equally compelling arguments on our hands: the original modal ontological argument and the reverse modal ontological argument. They share a second premise. Their conclusions are incompatible. So it all goes down to the first premise: God's existence is possible versus God's non-existence is possible. So then, given that God's existence cannot be a contingent matter, there are only two available positions. On the one side, there's the view that says that God possibly exists, and hence necessarily exists, and so actually exists. And on the other side, there's the view that says that God possibly doesn't exist, and hence necessarily doesn't exist, and so actually doesn't exist. It would be an obvious error to suppose that one of these two arguments constitutes a proof of one of these two positions, right? There's a symmetry between the first premises of the arguments, and this symmetry obviously isn't broken by the arguments themselves, right? These arguments themselves, therefore, give us no reason whatsoever to prefer one possibility premise over the other. Since the premises are incompatible, and since the arguments give us no reason to prefer one over the other, it's clear that neither argument gives us a reason to accept its conclusion over the other incompatible conclusion. In other words, both arguments rather overtly fail to prove or disprove God's existence. They make literally no headway whatsoever in the dispute between atheism and theism. Another way to put the symmetry problem is that, quite clearly, if you're not already a theist, you won't grant that the original possibility premise is more acceptable than the reverse possibility premise. And so the modal ontological argument then makes no headway in the dispute between theists and non-theists, right? Only those who antecedently accept theism are in a position to accept this original possibility premise over the reverse possibility premise, and hence the argument is powerless to give non-theists reason to accept theism. In itself, then, that is, without the aid of supplemental symmetry breakers between these first two premises, that is, reasons that differentially and uniquely support exactly one of them, so in itself, without such symmetry breakers, the modal ontological argument quite clearly fails. Now, for those curious about symmetry breakers, that is, reasons that purportedly favor exactly one of these possibility premises over the other, I do recommend checking out my user's guide to the modal ontological argument. I also recommend checking out my analysis article just published entitled Symmetry's Revenge, and finally stay tuned for a very special video on symmetry breakers later this year. I'll be making a video systematically examining basically every single symmetry breaker in existence. The video will be based on an exciting project of mine, the details of which will be available later. Well, actually, the details have already been made public, but oh well. And by the way, I said later this year that video would be coming out. That was a way too optimistic assessment. In short, when I said that, I wasn't taking into account how utterly and pathetically long the peer review process takes. So that video is not going to be coming this year, but it should be coming next year at some point, so that'll be fun. But anyway, this all shows the folly of people who say that the modal ontological argument forces the atheist to maintain a super strong claim, namely that God's existence is impossible. I mean, like, literally the same thing is true of the theist, right? They too are saddled with the equally strong claim that God's non-existence is impossible, and that literally every single non-theistic worldview is impossible. So no, the modal ontological argument doesn't raise the price tag of being an atheist by identifying a super strong claim that they're committed to, since the argument equally commits the theist to a claim that's at least as strong as the atheists. On to mistake number 124, saying that all ontological arguments try to define God into existence. No, that is not true. The modal ontological argument, for instance, doesn't say that God by definition exists, or given how we define God, God must exist. Instead, it says it's metaphysically possible that God exists. Its proponents try to motivate this through various symmetry breakers, and they try to conclude, based on a widely accepted system of modal logic, that God is therefore metaphysically necessary. Likewise, several other kinds of ontological argument don't just define God into existence, such as Gödel's ontological argument, which is based on the nature of positive properties and their entailment relations or lack thereof with negative properties. For more on this, see my ontological arguments playlist. My point here is just that this isn't being fair to ontological arguments. It's just wrong. Alright, mistake number 125, which is the last one of this video, ignoring controversy over system S5 of modal logic. So, it's relatively popular to take system S5 of modal logic to accurately capture metaphysical modality. By the way, that's the most commonly cited system of modal logic within which the modal ontological argument is valid, okay? That's the relevance of S5 to this portion of the video. So in its typical manifestations, the modal ontological argument assumes that this particular system of modal logic accurately captures metaphysical modality. Now, as I say here, that is a relatively popular view, but everyone should at least be aware that such a claim is still controversial. Many people on the internet act like it's a settled matter among philosophers, and many people just help themselves to System S5's axioms while being totally oblivious to the serious challenges that they face. I'm not going to get into these challenges here, since usually they're pretty technical, and so not very amenable to internet presentations, especially without significant background in modal logic on the part of the audience. Still, though, here are some resources that challenge elements of System S5 and its ability to accurately capture or model metaphysical modality. There's Chandler's analysis paper here, Nathan Salmon's paper here in Midwest Studies in Philosophy. But anyway, please don't ignore controversy over System S5 and its ability to accurately model or capture or represent metaphysical modality. Alright, and that concludes this 4th installment in our 7-part series on common mistakes about philosophy and religion. Again, if you see people make these mistakes, please link them to the video. I've already seen a number of people link to these sorts of videos on Twitter when they see other people on Twitter making these mistakes, and it just makes my day when I see that. So yeah, if you see people make these mistakes in your conversations, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, on OnlyFans, send this to them and say, hey, please don't make that mistake because it's wrong, and you shouldn't do things that are wrong. As always, please smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications. Please consider supporting me on Patreon or making a one-time donation. Links to both of those are in the description. Any amount helps. So much love to my existing patrons, and you get so many cool goodies as a patron. Access to bonus videos, exclusive content, papers of mine that are under review, etc. So many cool things.
It's so cool, believe me, folks. It is the coolest thing in the world.
And of course, what better way to end it there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.